to introduce today. I am Carol Molinares. I am the Deputy Communications Director here at Fair Fight. And this is episode 2 of the Fair Fight Reading Summer List. With this series, we're reading some books that help kind of make sense of the moment that we're in, this new moment of voter suppression. And today's is a big one. My guest today is someone whose work reveals, how much of the past is still being quietly, um, you know, w- being quietly writing our present. Our guest today is Dr. Carol Anderson. She is a historian at Emory University, and she writes about something deceptively simple, but it's not. And it's how policy gets made, who it's really built for, and who ends up paying for it, especially in the context of voter suppression still in 2026. The book that we're talking about today is One Person, No Vote. Dr. Anderson wrote it back in 2018. And here's the thing. It reads as if it was written for this exact moment, because her whole argument is that the fight over who gets to vote in America never actually really ended. The tactics just got a little bit more polished, more bureaucratic, and a little bit harder to detect. And that's what I want to do today. I want us to use it as a lens for, how we're seeing voter suppression and how it shows up in 2026. We're gonna, take a couple of the stories that she tells about the past and hold them up to what's happening right now. And I think you're going to see a lot of the resemblance. So, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amazing. So we'll kind of just jump straight into it. In your book, I think one of the most striking things is that modern voter suppression really does have a blueprint, and it's over a century old. Back in 1890, Mississippi rolled out a set of rules. What we call now, the Jim Crow policy of full taxes, literacy tests, and these impossible kind of understanding clauses. And I think one of the most glaring things about them is that none of that policy explicitly mentioned race. But for all intents and purposes, it targeted voters by race. The language is very coded. It talks about things like integrity and good character. And in one of the books, you mentioned a Virginia lawmaker named Carter Glass, um, who was asked point blank whether this was about voter fraud or preventing discrimination, and he said discrimination, obviously, to the very edge of what the Constitution will allow.
Mhm.
So my question to you is, walk us through how that generation learned how to write laws that were so brutal in its effect, but spotless on paper, and why that trick has been so hard to kill. Right now we're hearing a lot of that same vocabulary come from some of, the highest office in the country. We just had Donald Trump do an Oval Office address talking about, election security, integrity, and the speculation of fraud everywhere. So, when you hear that, especially, when modern politicians describe voting law that way, um, how does your historian's ears, pick up that the rest of us kind of just like walk right past?
So apocryphally, Mark Twain said, "History may not repeat itself, but it sure do rhyme." And so it's like listening to the rhymes. And so with the Mississippi Plan of 1890, what they talked about is we have got to end this corruption at the ballot box. We have got to have election integrity. We have got to stop all of this voter fraud. But what they were really dealing with was they were identifying that you had more black men registered to vote than white men. And that is what they saw as the corrupting influence, having black men registered to vote. And so how do we remove this corrupting influence from the ballot box? And so what they did was, but you have this thing called the 15th Amendment that says that the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So how do you write a law saying we don't want black folk to vote without writing a law saying we don't want black folk to vote? because prior to the 15th Amendment, you could explicitly write a law that said, "We don't want them to vote." It's like New York did that in the 1820s, wrote a law basically saying that white men did not have to pay a poll tax, and they increased the poll tax on black men by like 150% or more. But by 1870, you couldn't do that because the Constitution said you can't do that. So what they did was they said, "We're gonna take the legacies of slavery and make the legacies of slavery the access to the ballot box, and we're gonna make it sound legitimate." And so we're gonna say things like, "Oh, the poll tax. Democracy is expensive." And so if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee. Well, it wasn't such a small fee when you're dealing with the kind of endemic poverty that the formerly enslaved had, because they had hundreds of years of unpaid labor, followed by overwhelmingly sharecropping, where you didn't get paid doggone near much for sharecropping. Usually, you ended up in debt after sharecropping. And so when you don't have the money to pay a poll tax, no small fee is a big thing, and so what the poll tax amounted to for many in the Mississippi farm families was 2 to 6% of their annual income. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income, but again, this is just legitimate. Democracy is expensive, and so if you believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a fee. Think about how that's begins to resonate, how we understand IDs are simple. So if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to go get yourself an ID to be able to vote. It's that same kind of framing that puts the onus and the responsibility of access to the ballot box on the individual and not on the state. The other thing that they did was with the literacy test. They said, "We just think that it should be just logical so that someone who wanted to be able to vote should know what our policies are, should know what our values are, our good American values, and so they should be able to read the Constitution." Well, the thing is that when the enslaved had been systematically denied literacy, they could be killed for becoming literate. They could be killed for being educated. They could be tortured for being educated. And then coming out of the Civil War, you're looking at massively disparate funding for education. So white schools in Georgia, white schools were provided twice as much funding as black schools were, even though the populations were almost the same. And so when you're looking at that kind of disparity in funding, but then so the state is systematically denying an ability to meet the goals of what it takes to be able to vote. So when you're denying education, but you're requiring education. Wow. Wow. And then, I mean, this is a pattern we're gonna see over and over and over. And so Walter George, who was, a powerful senator out of Georgia, he said, "Look, why bother to evade? We have met the letter of the Constitution while systematically, going after its spirit, systematically violating its spirit." And the whole point was to make sure that black people could not vote. And so this is how they were able to basically write race neutral, racially targeted law. And when the US Supreme Court looked at this law and the effects of this law, so Mississippi lost about almost 96% of its black voters 2 years after this law was in place, to lose 96%. The US Supreme Court looked at that and said, "There this law does not violate 15th Amendment because everybody has to poll tax. Everybody has to take the literacy test, but not everybody had to deal with hundreds of years of slavery." And so you saw the US Supreme Court in the 1898, I think that was the Williams decision, systematically ignoring the evidence of racial discrimination and ruling that this was a race neutral law. When the other states saw this, this was like a get out of jail card free, and they just hit the they just went for it and rewriting their constitutions in order. You had these massive disfranchising constitutions happening coming out of the South at this point.
No, you're so right. So it kind of seems like the playbook has been, make a barrier look reasonable on paper, but its effects are very targeted.
Mhm.
Um, and I want to spend some time on this next stretch on the modern versions of that, and how we can relate that to what we're seeing right now because they are everywhere. So let's start at the front door of the polling place, which is voter ID.
Mhm.
voter ID is, one of the most normalized of all of these tactics, right? Most people here, you show an ID to vote, and think, sure, I show my ID at the pharmacy. And, I think one of the newest talking points that I saw was at Olive Garden, you have to show your ID to get unlimited salad and no, I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. That's what it was. And, people like to say, like, "Yeah, what's the big deal?" But in the book, you tell the story of an 86-year-old World War II veteran in Texas. And this is important. This is a man who served his country, who had just come back from a world war, who gets to the poll, hands over his veteran's ID, which is issued by the federal government, and it's rejected because it isn't on the approved list.
Mhm.
Uh, and how he shares the story is incredibly devastating. One of the things that he says is, he didn't feel like a citizen anymore. And I think that story hits harder for me than any statistic, because of how it kind of strips that humanity, how that it strips that right away from him. So my question to you is, help people understand, how does a law that sounds as simple as, bring your ID, end up turning away a decorated veteran and who is, someone who is actually, and who it is actually designed to stop.
So again, voter ID is like the poll tax or like the literacy test. It sounds reasonable, but it is not. And so what is it says it's designed to do is to make sure that you are who you say you are when you vote. But the way that it is set up is that you have these legislators going through who has what types of ID, looking at it demographically, and then making the decision about what kinds of IDs do you have to have in order to be able to vote. And so let me give you a couple of examples. In in Texas, what Texas did was said you must have a government issued photo ID to vote, but your ID from your state college or university does not count, but your gun registration card does. Now there is a demographic difference in who have the guns and who's going to college. And that demographic difference is how you're able to shape your electorate by shaping the kinds of IDs that you got to have in order to vote. In, in Alabama, Alabama said you must have a government issued photo ID to vote. But Alabama said that your public housing ID does not count. Now, does it get more government issued than public housing? But it didn't count because 71% of those in public housing in Alabama were African American. And for many, it was the only ID that they had. And so then happened after that was folks were like, "Okay, gosh, I gotta go get a driver's license." But remember, there is a disparity in who has cars because cars are expensive. You got the note, you got the maintenance, you got the gas, you got the gas, you've got the gas, you've got the parking. Cars are expensive. You've got the insurance. And so there is a fundamental difference in who has cars. But it's like, "Okay, fine. I want to vote. I've gotta go get a driver's license." Alabama, the governor listening to his mistress, you can't make this stuff up, listening to his mistress, shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties
Right.
and then made it sound reasonable. I have to be fiscally responsible. And because there's not a lot of traffic coming through these different um, sites, then it just makes sense to shut it down. But what that did was it made folks who lived in the Black Belt counties who did not have an ID to be able to vote have to go 50 miles over in order to be able to get the driver's license or the Alabama ID card that they needed to vote. But here, I ask you, if you don't have a driver's license, so you're not driving, how are you going to go 50 miles to go get the card that you need to be able to vote? And particularly when Alabama is ranked 48th or 49th in the nation in terms of public transportation. And so you make it sounds so ubiquitous, it sounds so logical, kind of like, "Well, how hard is it? How hard?" But it is very hard when you car and the access to the ID that you need is 50 miles away. In Texas, Texas only had, there were a third of Texas's counties that did not have departments of motor vehicles. And so that meant that folks had to basically make a 250-mile round trip. Texas, in its original law, had a reimbursement clause in there. But before it passed the law, it drew a red line through the reimbursement clause. So you had to pay out of your pocket to go that 250 miles. It is how you can make something sound really needed, really desirable, but underneath it, it is racially targeted, and it's going after the poor, it is going after Black folks, it's going after Latinos. What we saw happening in, North Dakota is that it went after the indigenous people because they had stood up and they had voted originally for Heidi Heitkamp for US senator, and then they stood up as Standing Rock, and that ticked off the legislature. And so they revised the photo ID law to say you have to have a physical address on your government issued photo ID. The problem with that is that over 60% of indigenous people lived on reservations in North Dakota, and on those reservations don't have a physical address. And so this is a way to wipe out 60% of a voting group by something that looks really logical, that's something that looks really innocuous, something that looks really mundane. You have to have a physical address. Again, it plays to a middle class norm. Well, how hard is it? Everybody's got a physical address. No, they don't. And the
Right.
legislature do that as it revised that law. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's a really, like, good point because, the book does a really good job, tracing, this to a long history of blocking Black voters specifically. But we know that, the policy that is instituted right now, is a larger expansion of voter suppression, and it tells us a lot about how voter suppression evolves. So now, we're kind of looking at this you know, new policy, but it really is the same playbook, and it now sweeps in a much wider group of us. So those are some very important stories to be told, and thank you so much for telling them.
Mhm.
So I kind of want to shift a little bit of the focus to talk about money and paperwork, right? Because that is one of the central pillars of how they do what they do.
Yes.
And this is kind of where history really starts to repeat itself. The old poll tax was a fee that you paid to vote, dressed up as a way to fund elections, like you mentioned. The courts eventually killed it. But, you argue that that idea never really changed. And when you think about what it costs to produce the right documents, ordering a certified birth certificate, getting a passport, taking the day off of work, that incredibly long drive that you mentioned to an office that's open only a couple days a week, if at all. Um, you know, right now we kind of see this proposal called the SAVE Act that would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote. And with that, you would have to show a passport or birth certificate in person. In the places already trying versions of this, like, Mississippi and Florida, you have married women, they're gonna be turned away, and not just married women, but plenty of folks who just don't have access or have the time to produce these documents, and they're gonna be turned away because either their name doesn't match, their naturalized citizens turned away, and frankly, people like me who haven't seen their birth certificate since their parents stuffed it, under a mattress for safekeeping, like 20, 30 years ago.
Right,
No.
right.
But, when you look at proof of citizenship requirements, through that lens of poll tax, what do you see? Is this something new, or is this the same barrier, kind of wearing that security integrity language? I'd love to know your thoughts.
I see 2 things. I see 1, using the scare tactics of voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. That's what they did with voter ID, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, did a study, and he found that over from 2000 to 2014, there were 31 cases out of 1 billion votes, 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. And the same goes with this whole thing about proving your US citizenship in order to vote. So what it's about, it's about the lie of the great replacement theory, that they're bringing over all of these immigrants and registering them to vote, and they're basically swamping our elections and diverting and changing the outcome of our elections. Not true. The Brennan Center did a study, as did the state of Georgia, as did the state of North Carolina. What they found was absolutely minuscule. And for the Brennan Center, they looked over 10 years and they found that out of 23.5 million votes, and they looked only at the jurisdictions that had significant immigrant populations. Out of 23.5 million votes, there were 30 documented cases of non-citizens, and so that's like 0.0000000. And then, for Georgia, out of 20,000,000 no, out of 8,000,000 votes, they had 20 non-citizens on the rolls. Only 9 of them voted. And what's happening in many of these cases, it's like it's folks who have green cards, and they have been given false information that they are eligible to vote. So it's not like they're going up there going, "Oh, I'm getting ready to, like, flip this thing." They have been given the false information that they're eligible to vote. And so this isn't that big scary thing, but that's what they keep drumming in our heads. Watching these people come in and just taking over our elections. They're taking over our elections. They're taking over. What the SAVE Act does is says you must prove your US citizenship. Well, your driver's license does not have your citizenship on it. Only 5 states in their real IDs have the citizenship on it. 45 states do not. And so that means you're gonna need a passport. A passport is somewhere between $130 and $165. And if you've got, like, 3 adults in your household, that's $165 each. Let's talk about what that means in this economy when you're shelling out $165 each in order to be able to vote, or to go find your birth certificate, which is just like, I have no idea, right? Where is it? Where is it? And so going through all of the paperwork to prove you were actually born here. And so it is designed to make it much more difficult for folks to vote. And let me be real clear here. When it requires basically a passport, only 34 to 38% of African Americans have a passport. The Brenner Center has identified that about 21 million Americans do not have the necessary US citizenship documentation that they need. 21 million. The State Department has said only 47% of Americans have a passport. Let's begin to think about what this means in terms of our elections, because there is a racial, of course, a racial and a class difference in terms of what that means in terms of being able to access the ballot box. And for the phantom reason of having all of these non-citizens voting. So they've got a major reason, but it's a scare tactic to get folks to move in that direction, to get folks to say, "Oh, yeah, this is okay. This is what we need." No. Already the form that you need to be able to sign off to register to vote says you recognize that if you're not a citizen, you can't be voting. That's already a federal crime. So it's already there. This is just a barrier to access the ballot box. So like I said, when only 34 to 38% of African Americans have a passport, wow. Imagine being able to wipe out 60 some percent of the Black population in terms of access to the ballot box. And begin to think about what it means for women, because we have heard these folks, not only have they been rumbling about the 15th Amendment, they've also been rumbling about the 19th Amendment,
Right.
women's right to vote. And so your current ID has to match your birth certificate. 80% of married women take their husband's last name. So that means that that name is not on your birth certificate. That name may be on your ID, but it's not on your birth certificate. So the level of documentation you have to bring to register to vote is just, it adds that extra layer of hunting, trying to find that piece of paper, looking for it, and it is designed to make people not be able to vote. So, and I would use a quote by, Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, and he was speaking before a group of Christians, and he said, "All of you are goo-goos." And they were like, "Goo-goos?" And he's like, "Yeah, you believe in good government because you want everybody to vote. Well, I don't, because quite candidly, our leverage goes up, voting populace goes down." So when you look at these measures that are designed to whittle away the voting population, it is the Heritage Foundation's recipe for being able to have inordinate power. Our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Right, and, it's kind of incredible that, in terms of the White House, a couple weeks ago, they held hostage an entire affordable housing bill, in order to get something like the SAVE Act, passed. I'm so glad that it doesn't have any legs and there's not a big possibility, of that going anywhere, but it really speaks to the tactics that they'll resort to in order, to disenfranchise so many people. And, all because they don't want I think it was, um, one of the officials, one of the Trump officials who said, "We want the right people to vote."
Exactly.
Yeah. And
Exactly.
and that kind of that brings me, what you were mentioning about, married women not having, that same last name in their certificate that they do their ID and the discrepancy that that causes. It really kind of brings me back to this term bureaucratic violence. Here in Georgia, you've got an exact match system, where a missing hyphen, a typo, all of these things could really freeze your voter registration.
Mhm.
And, you've got DMV offices and polling places closing in specific neighborhoods, like you mentioned. So suddenly, the nearest place to vote is about an hour away, with no bus line that goes directly through it. And I mean, on paper, none of this really looks dramatic, um, but the impacts of it are. And, that's why I kinda keep coming back to that phrase of bureaucratic violence because, nobody's standing, in the doorway, with a club anymore, right? It's a database, a form, something as simple as a typo, um, help people understand how something that bloodless can do the same work that literacy tests and billy clubs used to do. And, why we're just keeping the rolls so clean is so hard to argue against out loud.
Absolutely. So the in 2013, US Supreme Court gutted the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And what that did was it said the states that had a history of discrimination had to, before they could implement an election law of any kind, they had to get it approved by the US Department of Justice or by the federal courts in DC. The US Supreme Court gutted that. Just a few hours later, you had these states just these states just going hog wild, going, "Oh, I can do whatever I want. I can do whatever I want." And so this is why you saw, the Brennan Center has identified almost 1,700 polling places closed by these states. They have found that, and so you also have these massive purges happening. You had the curtailing of early voting happening. And so the impact of this, let's look at the 2016 election. In the 2016 election, when these states are just putting all these barriers up because now that they can, Black voter turnout went down by 7%, down by 7%. That had a major impact on the outcome of the 2016 election. And this was the impact of all of these suppression laws. When we're looking at, um, voter roll purges, you see these things where, um, wow. So it with the exact match, let's do exact match in Georgia. Exact match says that your registration has to exactly match what's there in terms of your Department of Motor Vehicles form or your Social Security form. And so if your name is Renee and you write it with an accent over the E, but there's no accent over the E in your Department of Motor Vehicles form, you get put in limbo. And so in the 2018 election, The last day of voter registration, Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State at the time, running for governor, he removed 53,000 voter registrants because of exact match. The vast majority, over 70%, were African American, and he put them in that registration limbo on the last day of voter registration. 53,000 folks just basically plucked out of the rolls. And with crosscheck again has that kind of sense of being just a data center. So what it says is that if you are registered in Virginia and if you are registered in Kansas, it really looks like voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. So we're going to kick you out of the rolls. And it looks at first name. It says it's looking at first name, last name, suffix, junior, senior, last four of your social security, and your date of birth. But that's not how it worked. They really didn't care about the last four of your Social Security. They really didn't pay attention to your birth date. They really didn't pay attention to suffix junior look like seniors. They really barely paid attention to your first name. So Jose like Jesus. They focused in on your last name. Well, in the United States, 80 the top of the top 100 most common last names, the top 80 are by minorities. So if your last name is Washington, there's almost a 90% chance it's African American. If your last name is Hernandez, there's over a 90% chance that you are Latino. If your last name is Lee, over 90% chance that you are Asian American. And so what that means by the focus in on the last name, they're wiping out. So you're seeing African Americans were overrepresented in these purges by 45%. Latinos were overrepresented in these purges by 24%, and Asian Americans overrepresented in these purges by 31%. Whites were underrepresented in these purges by 8%. And so what looks race neutral, what looks like it's just plain old technology, race neutral technology, in fact is racially targeted. And the US Supreme Court, so the other thing about you asked that question, it was a great question, keeping these voter rolls clean. Well, of course, because that becomes the argument in these purges. We just have to make sure we update our voter rolls. Well, the National Voter Registration says, okay, you can update your voter rolls if folks have died. You can update your voter rolls if folks have moved. You can't update your voter rolls. You can't purge folks simply because they haven't voted. I don't lose my right to religion simply because I haven't gone to church, right? So, but what Ohio did, Ohio was looking at folks who hadn't voted regularly and were removing them. But who doesn't vote regularly? Overwhelmingly, poor people and young people. It is a way to target those demographics and remove them from the voter rolls. And the U.S. Supreme Court in the Houston v. Versus the A. Philip Randolph Institute, in a 5-4 decision, said that's fine. You got to maintain those voter rolls. You got to keep those voter rolls clean. You got to make sure you don't have dead people on them. You make sure you have people on them who have moved. And so, why is this such a hard thing? And so, again, it's like voter ID. It sounds logical. It sounds reasonable. It is not reasonable. It is racially targeted. And so we have to keep our antenna up on those things that are targeted because we know what they're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, it just reminds me of the story that you had shared in your book, about those voter roll purges where, there was a Navy veteran named Larry Harmon who shows up to vote and finds out he had been erased, basically exactly what you said, for not voting often enough. And this came with no notice to him. And those are some of the very same tactics that are being used here. I think if you're going to remove someone for a voter roll, at the very least, they should receive a notification to rectify the issue.
Mhm.
And in a state where I live, Florida, where I grew up, there was a policy passed where they were going to clean up the voter rolls, and so if you hadn't voted in the last two elections, and that is including a special election in between, which I so many folks don't go out to vote for special elections.
Mhm.
You would get purged out of the voter roll, and they would send you kind of this like innocuous postcard that you were supposed to respond to. It kind of looked like a mailer, one of the mailers that you get in the middle of like the primary, where you look at it, you're like, oh, this is garbage, and you throw it out. All of a sudden, you go to your voting location, and you're just no longer in the rolls. And those it's situations like that that are incredibly disheartening. But what I don't wanna do is leave us on a non-positive note.
Right.
So to leave us on a positive note, I wanna talk a little bit about the ending of your book, which, the book turns to what actually does work. You write in there about the 2017, Senate race in Alabama, of all places,
Mm.
um, where the thing that moved the needle wasn't that giant ad budget. It wasn't the millions of dollars that we were, throwing into digital or TV ads. It was people. It was, groups who were running clinics to help neighbors get documents that they needed to qualify for an ID. There was a woman named Perman Hardy
Mhm.
who had spent years personally driving dozens of her neighbors to a single polling place, which is incredible. And, it was, filled with stories of organizers who learned, to tell people not just, "Please go out and vote," but, "You're a voter, that's who you are." And, that concept of, really socializing and being and making voting part of someone's identity and so it's part of someone's culture, was also incredibly important. So what does that chapter teach us about how ordinary people actually beat the system built to exhaust them? Because I can tell you, I'm exhausted right now. Um, but I'm still going out there and making sure that my family's voting, that my friends are voting, and why does history suggest that this is still the answer?
It is the answer because if your vote wasn't powerful, they wouldn't be trying to take it away from you.
That part.
And it's
Yep.
because when we mobilize, oh my gosh, it is something beautiful, and so that's why that Alabama story just sang to me. So Alabama had deployed every method of voter suppression against this Black population, every method. And this was 2017 where there was this special election for the US Senate, where you had Doug Jones, who had been the prosecutor going after the guys who had killed those 4 little girls in Birmingham by putting a bomb in the church. And then you had Judge Roy Moore as his opponent, and Judge Roy Moore, who was the man who had been banned from a mall because of stalking little girls. But the polls basically said that Judge Roy Moore was gonna be the one because Alabama's a red state and Judge Roy Moore was red. Organizers got in there and did the work, and I mean a group of organizers. It wasn't just one organization, it was a range of them, each of them taking on a piece of this mess. And so Alabama, for instance, had basically had felony disfranchisement. So they said in their 1901 constitution, their disfranchising constitution, if you have been convicted of a crime of moral turpitude, then you can't vote. But they never defined moral turpitude. So you didn't know whether your burglary conviction was in fact a crime of moral turpitude or not. You didn't know whether your conviction for passing bad checks was moral turpitude or it took civil society going in there pounding on Alabama hard, and so finally in 2017, in the spring of 2017, Alabama defined moral turpitude: rape, murder, treason, the biggies. And so these organizations took the Secretary of State and said, "Great, all of those folks that you told they could vote, tell them they got their voting rights back." And he said, "I don't think that's a good use of state resources." They looked at him and said, "Ooh." But they didn't stop. They, in fact, organized and they set up what they called restoration clinics. And so what they did was through social media as well as through the radio, because they knew that they were dealing with different demographics. Some folks get their news on the radio, some folks only go from social media. And it's like, if you have been convicted of a crime and you're out, You too, you would just might have your voting rights back. Come to this restoration clinic." And they had a team of lawyers there, folks' records, and they had then a team of volunteers getting folks registered to vote. They also had folks who were going into the jails because the way that the law works is that if you had not been convicted, if you were just jailed, you could vote absentee, and so they were organizing those folks as well. I mean, this is full on, and then they had folks from the college campuses organizing those students, and then they set up, polling Alabama has shut down 60 polling places. And so they set up a system where people could say, "Hey, I need a ride to the polls," and somebody would come pick them up and take them to the polls and bring them back. I mean, it was looking at every method that Alabama had deployed. You had a group that got in there, like Vote Riders got in there in early January, just getting folks the document because you cannot do this work by showing up in October trying to get something to happen in November. That doesn't happen. So it's requiring a level of forethought. And so they got in there in January and just started getting folks the documentation they needed and getting folks the ID. So it's similar to the Highlander Folk School during the Civil Rights Movement, where it wasn't, or the civics education pieces that SCLC was doing, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It wasn't about arguing about the literacy test. It was about making sure that folks could pass the literacy test.
Right.
So here it wasn't about arguing about voter ID. It was making sure that folks had the ID that they needed to vote. And it worked, really worked. I mean, so I remember this election. I was watching it on TV, and so you saw it red, 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 and then there was blue Huntsville, and then red, 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 and then Selma, boom, and at the time, it was Twitter. Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, tweeted, "Selma? Lord Selma." And 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 you saw this big blue, and it was like, and then you saw Montgomery, big blue. Then you saw Birmingham, big blue. I mean, the voter turnout was a doggone amazing. It had hit Judge Roy Moore so hard that there weren't enough white Christian evangelicals to get him off of the mat. Whoo! And yeah, this is why we don't have a Senator Roy Moore. It is because of that incredible organizing, and it was black voters going in and not saying, "Oh, you need to vote," asking people what they wanted, and so linking what people's desires are with the vote, and so it was really strategic, it was really brilliant, it was organized. That's what we have to do. These folks are coming after our votes so that they can shape policies in ways that are really detrimental to our well-being. We have to organize, we have to get in there, think through, how do we do this? What is this? How are they blocking us here? How are they blocking the vote here? How are they blocking the vote there? And what are the mechanisms that we have the power to change? What we have the power to get our community up and to the polls. What can we do? And that's what I saw. That's why I have at the end of the book the showing how it's possible to overcome all of these barriers to access to the ballot box, all of these barriers to democracy.
Right, and I think, us as a country can't continue to thrive if we're only half represented. You close your book with Lincoln's line of, "A country can't survive half slave, half free," and you argue, we're drifting into that realm of half democracy, half not, depending on your zip code.
Mhm.
And so I wanna give you some time to, give some last thoughts, about, what do you most want people watching this to do with that idea?
So what voter suppression is designed to do is to make you feel it's hopeless. It's to make you feel that nothing changed. It's always been what it's always gonna be, and so there's nothing I can do about it. No, you have the power. Wield that power. Embrace that power. Vote. Get your neighbors to vote. Understand and pay attention to what they're doing. So the SAVE Act was kind of flying under the radar, but it's understanding what the SAVE Act is designed to do. There's also other elements that they're trying to deploy that's flying under the radar. So you hear the kind of things about, well, maybe we'll have ICE at the polls. We know what that's about. Raise 10 tons worth of bejeebers about that. Um,
Right.
I and because what happens is that when there is an engaged population that is fighting for democracy, you will find that the autocrats will crumble because they're not used to resistance, and so it is that resistance, it is that fire for democracy that we have. We have power, and walk into not just this election, subsequent ones, and part of what it also means, it is civic engagement, so it's not like we walk away after the election. We make sure that our representatives are held accountable for the decisions that they're making.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I couldn't have said it better. Frankly, no, I know that I couldn't say it better. You've been amazing, Dr. Anderson. Thank you so much. I think that this was exactly the conversation, we hope to have. And if today did what I think it did, you're never going to look at a boring election rule change, random bureaucratic policy change the same way again. And that's, I think, the whole point of this book. And that's really, why we do this series, to really kind of hand the public a lens. The history of the vote in this country is a history of its people, and particularly people deciding who counts, and other people refusing to let politicians get away with what they do. And knowing which history and which story you're standing in is exactly where it starts. So again, thank you, Dr. Anderson, for being here live, and to everyone listening. I want to make sure that you all get subscribed to our channel, so that you don't miss the next one. And we will see you soon.
Okay. Oh, so the name of the book, I'm looking at the questions. The name of the book is One Person, No Vote: How
One
Voter
person.
Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Really appreciate your time. And everybody, go please buy One Person No Vote. Bye all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.